Hello everybody, I'm Alexy Khrabrov, the organizer of SF Scala, and here we are on location at Twitter headquarters, where Scala is used to power all the tweets you guys can send about this event. And here we are with Stu Hood, who's a staff software engineer at the developer productivity group at Twitter, who's going to talk about the history of Scala at Twitter. And today is a very special meetup because we talk about the past and the future. Hi Stu, hi. It's great to have you with us. Yeah. So Twitter is a well-known success story for Scala, but when you started, I think it was not yet clear how Scala is going to fit, what's going to happen. So can you kind of shed the light a little bit? Why did you join Twitter? What brought you to Scala, and what made it such a formidable weapon in the arsenal of social media?
Absolutely. So I had been a Java developer for a little while before joining Twitter, and actually, at least partially because of Twitter, I started looking at Scala and kind of wrote a few toy projects initially. Slightly after that, my path aligned in terms of I was working on an open source project called Cassandra, and Twitter was using Cassandra. It ended up being more significant that Twitter was using Scala in the longer term, because that's where I ended up staying involved longer. So. It was fairly early in Twitter's Scala days in 2010, where we first crossed paths. And
so I guess why Scala, right? Now I think it's we know that Twitter is a success story for it, but in 2010 probably was not such an obvious choice.
Right. I think well, there's been plenty written on the fact that they wanted a language that was as expressive as Ruby, while providing vastly more type safety and performance than they were getting with dynamic languages. And it appealed to me as somebody who enjoyed writing performant code. Data structures and algorithms mostly just worked in Scala. The focus on immutable data structures was huge. Yeah.
That's all great. And actually, it's very interesting to know about Cassandra, because Cassandra is now big with Spark, and so Spark runs on top of Cassandra. So there is there is a second coming of Scala to Cassandra, which serves this important role in persistence. But I've seen a lot of projects actually coming out of Twitter in terms of storage and a lot of different. So there is Finagle, which is its own RPC stack. So can you talk a little bit about how the whole stack evolved, and kind of what are your favorite pieces about the stack, where you contributed, kind of which is your kind of best playground?
Sure. Well, the stack at Twitter evolved again, kind of out of the service-oriented architecture, needing to bloom behind the scenes, behind the front ends. Over time, and actually during the talk, you'll see there's a particular inflection point where it starts to move closer to the front end and be more of a general tool. There were a few questions in there. What other questions did you have?
Yeah, so what are your favorite pieces?
Favorite pieces? So I worked a little bit on the social graph database for a while. I wouldn't call it my favorite piece of the stack. I think it attempted to be a little bit too reusable, too generic. Didn't include enough of the API, but Finagle is kind of the classic example of a library that I absolutely love. Hummingbird came out a little more recently, and is also just a great composition of a few different Twitter libraries. I think there's lots of other, Stitch. I don't know how much of a splash Stitch has made, but Stitch I think is a very, very important part of Twitter's future. We
had a talk on it at SF Scala, I think, a few months ago here, and also at Scala by the Band. It really sounds like a yes. We got Jake to speak, and it's available on functional.tv, and it's a great piece of software.
It's huge because I think more and more, if you go back in database papers, you see discussions of how you build queries in an environment where you don't have a single database anymore. You've got multiple databases, and you want to be able to deploy them independently, and you want them to have their own management. And I think Stitch is the beginning of an answer to that for Twitter. We'll see.
Do you see adoption happening inside Twitter?
Yeah. I measured some of that. It's still early days. You can't quite see a trajectory, but the adoption is very good. And in some cases, it cannibalizes usage of futures in cases where, well, I was doing something eagerly, but I might as well do it lazily. And so to some degree, it's cannibalizing some of that usage, but I get numbers in the deck. It's at 1 or 2% of Scala files import stitch.
Interesting, interesting. So you're one of the early Scala people at Twitter, right? And kind of, I mean, in internet years, right? This is ancient history, and like there is this whole success story which Twitter kind of traveled through. So I wonder, and you see Scala engineers joining, and it's probably one of the biggest groups of Scala developers in the world. And I wonder how the dynamics works, because we have this so-called Scala tribes, which we kind of had. There is a extreme FP tribe, and there is Java-like tribe. And I think Twitter has this efficient Scala tribe, which Marius described as the middle ground, but obviously stitches a little bit, I think, to the FP side of this. So how do you see engineers of all kinds kind of absorbed into this big bird organism and kind of finding the tribe? How does the dynamic work inside Twitter?
So I think that was a problem, particularly in the early days, because there wasn't a huge established code base. Core libraries weren't as ingrained into the code that you were going to be reading. But I think having core libraries that display these appropriate conventions has been huge. So we definitely still hear people join and say, I'm familiar with doing something in Java, but they can find tons and tons and tons of examples. And many of them are in our open source code as well, but very large code base internally that they can see anecdotes in. So I think over time it's been less of an issue that people are totally disoriented and unsure of which direction to go in. Yeah, I talked about it in the talk, but there are plenty of examples where there's a choice between doing something in an OO or functional paradigm, and it's not always obvious. It's very context specific, which I think is part of the strength of Scala. It's not clear that you should always be functional. So yeah, still plenty of debates about that, but it's mostly faded. How
do you guys solve this actually in real life? Let's say somebody wants to use object-oriented idiom and somebody else wants to use FP. Is it decided by seniority? Do you have to convince people? How it plays out?
I think one thing that ends up guiding the decision to a huge degree is that we all pretty much agree on immutability. There's a little bit of usage of mutable variables, but always in closed states, and that kind of ends up limiting some of the patterns you can use. So you'll only use certain object-oriented patterns. Like the builder pattern is actually an object-oriented pattern, but it is immutable, and so it works fairly well. Other things don't work so well. So kind of on a pattern-by-pattern basis, it's fairly clear.
Interesting. So Twitter also spans, I think, now a huge variety of applications. So you have Finagle, you have Scalding and Hummingbird. How do these pieces of Twitter stack coordinate, right? So do you have a lot of cross-pollination between different groups? Do you have kind of a lot of shared libraries, or is it mostly silos? Or how does it work between the pieces of organization?
We have a huge number of shared libraries, and I think the glue of that is still Finagle, in the sense that there are lots of services deployed, and even if you're an analytics job, you may end up using Finagle to talk back to online services. And I think Finagle has sprouted its own teams, essentially, for coordination. There used to be a coordination team. Now they're calling it Traffic, which I think is an excellent name. But it's all about routing and kind of replacing components of the routing. I hope that Marius will give a great talk on that sometime soon.
Yes, definitely. So, always happy to have Marius.
Yeah. But I don't think any of it is closed source. That any of the stuff managed by the Traffic team, it's all in Finagle.
And also we are planning to have a Finagle workshop at Scala by the Bay in August. So folks, watch scala.bythebay.io website. We hopefully will have a lot of training and talks about Finagle and other pieces of Twitter stack. I wonder, I think it's always this perennial question, how Finagle compares to Akka and its own stack, because I think we have kind of this dichotomy where the rest of the world is using Akka and people are actually using Finagle, because I think Twitter Offspring sharing spreads around the community. So folks like Pinterest are using Finagle, but not necessarily all of them are using Mesos and Finagle in combination. So can you talk a little bit about like this whole package? Do you have to have Mesos to run Twitter stack? Is it fine just to use pieces of this? And what's your view on kind of Finagle versus Akka and kind of these two different stables of code?
I mean, so you definitely don't need to use Mesos and Aurora to use Finagle. I think, and in particular, you don't have to use. You do have to use Twitter util to use Finagle, but you can just embed that as a library into almost anything you build. The only other thing we'd recommend using with it is Twitter Server, and Twitter Server is just CLI args. And then a tiny, tiny harness, kind of in the vein of Coda Hale's, what was it called? Shoot, do you have Coda Hale? Wrote it's a Java helper library, great library, and it's metrics, right? And it fits into his other drop wizard.
Yes, right. The API.
So I think Twitter Server is Twitter Server plus Finagle kind of gets you most of the way to something like drop wizard. But we don't always kind of advertise it as a complete package. If you use it as a complete package, it out of the box is fairly good. All of them still work together.
Zipkin, right?
Yeah, Zipkin. Yes, Zipkin is still. It's kind of the fabric. We're an overlay of all these libraries, and is useful anytime you're using Finagle.
And Zipkin used to write to Cassandra.
Zipkin will write to all kinds of stuff. Loggers. It'll log is really what it'll do.
Yes.
I don't know if we're writing directly to Cassandra right now.
So you basically get instrumentation for free, and you get it throughout the stack, right?
Yeah,
so this which actually makes Twitter stack so appealing, because you can basically take all this stuff and you have all your metrics and instrumentation in the same package.
And I think, I'm sorry to interject, but also I think the work that the traffic team is doing goes into the same vein of Zipkin. It's rather than like post facto figuring out what happened. Before we begin the request, let's route it appropriately, and then later on we can tear it down. But more power while planning your requests, and whether to route it to an entirely different service in order to test some code over there and then return to the production path is. So, sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. That makes it, I think very interesting about Twitter stack, because one dream of many, startup founders is to get Twitter in the box for the backend, right? So I think with most of backend in open source, you probably can do, right?
Sorry.
I'm very curious about Mesos. I'm a big fan of Mesos, and Ben Hidman also was an early advisor, and I kind of followed Mesosphere with great interest, and I kind of big proponent of this. So how close is this dream of developers not asking DevOps people for things, right? Like, can you just schedule a Scala job on Mesos cluster? It will connect to other services and kind of just work. Is this really what happens at Twitter, or do you have from time to time to have kind of manual intervention to see what's going on?
That really is what happens at Twitter now. I can say that definitively. I would say that the thing that's missing is that it is still a human that's going to launch that job. So we haven't quite reached the meta level of, I would like to spin up a unique instance of a service that's already running and not clobber the one that's running currently. So sit over here, ensure that all routing avoids it. Only the ones that I actually route there should go there. So not participating in the Zookeeper ensemble or whatever it might be, because it's not always Zookeeper anymore.
Nice.
So I think, yes, absolutely, you can spin up an application, but the plurality of applications is still where the work is happening.
Interesting. That sounds great. So I'll probably close with this question. When ACM celebrated first 50 years of computing, they actually had this huge 100 years of computing celebration, because they were looking at the next 50 years, right? So we're on the startup time here, so at 5 years of Scala at Twitter, and so we'll look at next 10 years of Scala at Twitter. So what do you think is going to happen most importantly in the next 5 years, and where do you want it to be in 10 years when we meet here again and see, what's going on?
So I want both simplification and advancement within the language. One of the things that definitely brought me to it initially was the research qualities. Twitter pushed back on on development within the language because it caused churn for us for a long time. But I think we're finally approaching the point where we can say, yeah, I think we're definitely interested in pushing the boundaries again because we're able to keep up, finally.
That sounds great.
So we're very interested in whatever the community can bring.
Thanks too. This is great, and we're looking forward to the next era of Scala at Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.